Jim Joyce. I
Here we are,
honestly
man.
did not even realize it's Wednesday until I know we're like even a few minutes late. It just kind of hit me like, oh crap, it's the shot time. So super happy about that because I needed this middle of the week break, man.
Yeah, your energy level seems very, you seem like you have a lot on, man. You seem like you're balancing a lot of things. That's how your energy feels, like you're kind of had a busy week.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you do as well, given last week's stuff. So I think we're both lots of balls kind of being juggled, catching most of them, I think. But
yeah, like right beforehand, you were asking me like what the news and digital health, and I feel like I'm so heads down with my own stuff right now, and I'm actually I'd like to get to a conference or something, like to kind of meet some people, but I think that's not going to be until New Year. So
no, we're honestly we're looking forward to going to try to do a little bit of a break, around Christmas through New Year. So we just booked a trip to Tbilisi, Georgia. So going right after Christmas. So at least unwind. But to your point, I've been adding the WTF Justice show to my watch list, and I just haven't been able to get to it. Just been from dusk till dawn.
That's what this is for. So I know this week. So this week we have a guest that I brought in. So I brought in a phenomenal medic, Professor John Armstrong. So
I'm gonna let him in. Yeah.
Let him in.
And this is a good. Sorry, go ahead. Well, do the intro, and then when he joins, I'll.
Yeah, no. What I love about this one is, John's coming at the digital health space from a clinical end. He's a medical director at the Health Beacon, but he's invested in all kinds of projects. So, hey, John, I was just doing a poor job introducing you as you were walking in the call here. But
keep going, Jim. You're doing much better than I ever could. You're good at that stuff.
He's doing your 60-second pitch, and I was just telling Jim before you joined, I couldn't find you on the interwebs. I know we are meticulously unproduced, and we met briefly, a couple of weeks back, right? But I couldn't find anything to. So I'm going to enjoy today's discussion, getting to know you.
That's because I don't actually exist. I'm an avatar.
That's the digital part.
I'm a professor bot rather than an actual doctor.
No, but I love this one because also like John. So we have for our millions of listeners out here, we have Professor John Armstrong, medical director to Health Beacon, advisor to Oyster Capital, one of the investors. Just a fantastic guy that I think is smitten with the digital health space. And this is you've met Eugene virtually or through something, right? So
well, we met in
Dublin, right? We met in Dublin.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
I know that to get onto this podcast, you have to actually usually be from Barcelona, but no, we didn't meet in Barcelona. I keep hearing Barcelona on all your podcasts.
But John is also a travel commentator. He's also a travel commentator, or to some degree. But anyways, John, I'll let you, for the millions of listeners, introduce yourself for a moment, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so my background is that I'm a radiation oncologist. So my specialty is to treat cancer patients with radiation as part of a multidisciplinary team. So I've been in the area of radiation oncology since 1985. I suppose what distinguishes my specialty is that we use very high-end technology with a vast amount of computerization. So a lot of the treatments we deliver are delivered by computer-driven machines. So I've always had a keen appreciation of what the technology can deliver in terms of patient care. My clinical practice is based in a number of places here in Dublin, and it's split between actual clinical care and running clinical trials, and of course the academic side of things, lecturing and teaching. So I've got a long history of doing clinical trials. Starting in 1997, myself and a guy called John Crown set up Irish Clinical Oncology Research Group. We had both come back from the States, and we saw how cooperative clinical trial structures could improve outcome for cancer patients by testing new treatments at the early stage of development and ultimately in the phase 3 randomized trials. And we saw there was a complete lack of that kind of infrastructure here in this country. So we set it up in 97, and it's been a great success. From when we started it, there was John, myself, and the manager. And as you know, like all Irish organizations, the first item on the agenda was the dissolution of the organization. But we survived. We survived all that, and now it's a really successful organization, which is in receipt of Health Research Board funding and runs trials in collaboration with international groups and, you know, investigator-initiated trials based here in Ireland as well. So that's my background, and my big interest in cancer has always been the clinical trials and the idea of finding new technologies which are promising and pushing them into the clinic and trying to make that happen. And obviously, sometimes we do it, it's hypothesis driven, that your idea is that you can come up with a clinical trial where in a particular scenario, you can make people live longer or have a better outcome or have less toxicity. But also it's because when we do clinical trials, we push the technological know-how in the country. And they've been the big drivers of my motivation to be involved in clinical trials in cancer over the years.
Awesome. And where did you train again in the US?
Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, which I was there for 3 years as a resident, and then I did 5 years on staff there, and I ran the radiation research program for lung cancer there at that time. Yeah, very exciting time. That was when the computer technology was revolutionizing the way in which we design and deliver radiotherapy.
Right.
Did you ever visit all the way north in Manhattan, a little district called Inwood? It was highly Irish. Inwood, all the way almost on the border of the Bronx. So
yeah, right. Yeah, it's not. Is it called Inwood? It's called
I thought it was Inwood.
Yeah, you know, I know exactly. I've been to the pubs there many a times. It's the one that because I went to Fordham in the Bronx.
Yeah.
I lived in subsidized housing in Manhattan for the 8 years, and that was just a great place to live. I don't know if you know the FDR Drive. There's 2 buildings around just north of the Queensborough Bridge, where there's 2 buildings actually perched on stilts on the FDR. I lived in one of those.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
And Jim, I did look this up. So what is Inwood? The neighborhood of Inwood in Manhattan still has an amazing amount of traces of strong Irish presence of the past. Blah, 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 blah.
Okay, Inwood.
I was right. Inwood. INWOOD.
Okay, yeah. Maybe I'm thinking of another.
I was living in Washington Heights, and that's right below Inwood. Inwood was one up. Yeah. So anyway, just connecting the New York dots. That's how maybe John and I crossed on the street somewhere back in the day. I don't know.
Well, like he's from the
we would never have said hello. People don't say hello when they cross the street in New York.
It's all changed. And then before we go in, like, so John, and then also just on the the investment side. So you do advisory for investors looking at investing in digital health companies like Health Beacon, but also other stuff. So maybe some sense on that.
Yeah, so the background to that, Jim, is I've always been acutely aware that, you know, a massive percentage of GDP and public expenditure goes on healthcare. And yet when we trained as doctors in med school, we never received a single lecture or course or tutorial on finance, on management, on anything. And even when you do your specialty training in medicine, it's sort of a taboo subject. So I've always been aware that this was the elephant in the room, that we made all these decisions about patient care in isolation from knowing the financial impact, or we would make financial expenditures and not be aware of the fact that we mightn't be getting good value for money at all on it. So it gave me a really keen appreciation of the need to get smart about how we do things. And then I got involved in the actual development from the ground up of some radiotherapy centers here in Ireland. And that taught me a lesson about, you know, how ultimately the finance dictates everything. So that got me interested in that area of financial investment. So I advised a good pal of mine, Bill McCabe, who's the principal in Oyster Technology, about their financial investments. And they were really impressed with what they saw about Health Beacon at an angel investor meeting. And so we started to look into your company.
Yep. And so just to connect the dots, they're our largest shareholder.
Got it.
From Capital, yeah. But you know, I gotta get some other subjects in here before we go into the real thing. And sorry to ask other questions, but so
isn't
fish
this
farming
thing,
and
though?
yeah, this is the real thing. I want to get. No, I just want to share with Eugene. I want to get like fish farming and travel.
So, well, the fish. Okay, I'm a lifelong angler who has, you know, gone over to the soft side of things. So now I keep koi carp. And I've got Bill interested in it as well. But let's just say that our investments better do better than our koi carp projects, because we've been like, I don't know, I think our carp are called Moses. You know, they've put 7 plagues upon us. We have just had a whole load of deaths from our koi carp. So I won't, you know, be putting that on my CV anytime soon.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So
go ahead.
You know, I wanted to go a little bit, you know, just as you're so passionate about kind of the clinical trials, and we've had some guests on it, more again on the digital side and the distributed and decentralized clinical trials. Where are you with all of this? Because it feels like, will some of this snap back, right, and go back to physical locations, or is it going to be kind of, just curious what you're seeing out there?
I suppose going back to, you know, looking at clinical trials, what's wrong, what's good about them and what's wrong, what's bad about them. What's good about them is the obvious thing. We get to test things and we prove they work, and, you know, evidence-based healthcare. And once we find that a treatment A is superior to treatment B, you know, the government, etc., has to fund it. So that's ultimately the great thing about it. And it also raises academic standards. And it also means that when you are doing a clinical trial, for instance, in Ireland, we sign up to an American clinical trial. We are committed in our hospital to doing everything for the patients on that trial the way this bunch of, you know, tip-top world experts have said it should be done. And once you start doing that in your department for John Smith, it's very hard not to do it for John Jones. So it has this spillover effect. So ultimately, you know, I'm a real enthusiast about clinical trials, but what's wrong with them is that they've become so incredibly bureaucratic. And that goes back to good origins always, but bad implementation of those origins. So if we go back to the beginning, the Nuremberg medical trials, it became obvious that we needed a whole ethical framework for the conduct of research on human subjects. And as the years have gone by, there has been episodes of fraud in clinical trials. And because of that, the government type bodies do what they always do. They come up with a vastly increased bureaucracy designed to solve the problem that they've detected. And we live with each and every aspect of that bureaucracy going forward. So specifically at the moment in clinical trials, as I see it, the requirement for bureaucracy in terms of verification of data, delegation of responsibility logs. I mean, it would do your head in trying to be an investigator at present. It's so intensely bureaucratic. So anything that can possibly reduce that burden has to be a good idea, because the problem with this is that bureaucracy is so expensive that it means that big pharma can definitely do the trials they want to do, and they should be doing it because they come up with good products, no question about that. But little academics who've got an academic notion are made to operate according to the same incredibly rigorous bureaucratic standards. So it means if we want to ask a relatively simple academic question, it's incredibly expensive for us to do it. And our staff spend 90% of their time on mind-numbing bureaucratic paperwork.
Raising money. And raising money as well, you know.
And you've got to raise the money to do it. It's incredible. Yeah. So anything that can, so for instance, when we collect data, we bring someone into the clinic and we ask them how they are. We do a toxicity assessment. For instance, they're getting a new treatment, and that toxicity assessment is done face-to-face, and we've got to record all that data, and then it's all got to be verified and has to go into the system and has to be subject to rigorous quality checks, etc. If we can have a situation where patients are generating data at home all by themselves, for instance, we can have a different regulatory approach to that. We can say, this is patient-driven data fed live through an app, for instance, connected to a device like HealthBeacon, and we know that it's coming direct from that source. It shouldn't need an additional level of bureaucratic assessment. And if we look at it from the patient's point of view, if you, for instance, got cancer, where do you want to be? You want to be with your grandkids. You want to be at home with your spouse. You do not want to be sitting in my outpatients waiting to come in and see me so we can sit together and fill in a few stupid forms. You know, really anything that gets the patient out of the hospital into the community, whether it be for assessments or for actual therapies like injectables or medication taking, is a great idea.
And virtual clinical trials, right? I mean, when Apple came onto the scene, and you know, the recruitment possibilities are just amazing, right? Just from a sheer number. So how do you look at that? And we also had Michelle Longmire from Metabol, right? So the decentralized platform that they raised 300 mil just recently. So again, congrats to the team there. But virtual clinical trials?
Yeah, I mean, it does depend on what you're doing. You know, for instance, if your actual clinical intervention by definition has to be in a hospital, there's a limit to how far that can go. So if I'm testing a new type of radiation treatment, you know, you have to come to hospital for that. But for the follow-up assessments of that, there's absolutely no reason to be bringing the patient back and asking them, for instance, if they've got prostate cancer, how their sexual function is, or how their urine function is, or how their back passage is working. You can do all of that virtually. You can get a PSA blood test wherever they want it. And so absolutely, that's a great idea to be able to do that. I think, didn't CBS get involved in recruiting patients for one of the COVID vaccine trials?
Totally. I don't know much of it specifically. But
They're actually spinning. There's a
saw,
whole business that they launched, right, on clinical trial recruitments, CVS. As well. Yeah.
I read about it, but I don't know. I'm not an expert in that.
So I think community type research like that, it has vast potential.
Yeah. Where do you think, like, so when you just thinking about like your area of oncology for a second, you know, and you know, like digital health, like Eugene, like, do you know digital tech opportunities within oncology? You know, what are you seeing out there?
I mean, just tracking back, I mean, quite a lot. And again, right. So to me, I look at digital health very much on sort of, I'll say in front or in touchable, for lack of a better term, by the end consumer, right? I think it's been defined sort of broadly. And so if you go back to, you know, pharma, I think there's a lot of AI companies that get bundled into digital health and finding new targets and proteins and all of that. So I think there's been quite a lot of developments back to kind of the digital therapies, but more on the mental health components surrounding oncology, right? That's, I think, one of the key things that I've been seeing. I mean, let's face it, there's no digital technology today that can reduce and I mean digital as in, you know, DTX or digital behavior change that can reduce a cancer,
I think it's like
a tumor.
early detection, it's treatment, it's surrounding support systems. You know what I mean? Like you have the skin cancer, you know, the kind of that's where, you know, like Steve,
diagnostic and support, right? That's kind of, and then in between are sort of hard science around, you know, robotics and injections and molecules, right?
And if you think about that, John, do you see, has anything come into clinical practice yet that's kind of clear other than doing virtual and telehealth appointments, or?
No, not really. I mean, obviously we're continuing to use artificial intelligence in my own specialty to try and augment the process of designing treatment. But that's very much hospital based. It's very high end. Where I would see in oncology is, you know, the focus on oncology obviously is survivorship, but that's not the hardest thing in the world to assess. You know, unfortunately, you're either alive or you're not alive. But this, you know, for many patients, at least as important is quality of life, and quality of life extends into a lot of domains. There's general domains of quality of life when you've got cancer. You know, anxiety, stress, insomnia, all these things you can think of. And then there's also disease-specific quality of life issues, like, for instance, if you have a patient with breast cancer, you know, her body image, her sexuality, her intimacy, that there are a whole lot of things. And when we're looking at treatments, comparing treatments, we're always focused primarily on making people live longer. And we do try, and the NCI, for instance, have insisted that we have a lot more tools for measuring quality of life as part and parcel of our research trials, but it all costs money. And every questionnaire that you want filled in, you've got to get that filled in, and you administer the questionnaire, you've got to analyze it, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And so I think it would be great if we had more automated ways of people using apps at home, being able to fill in that data for us and feed that information to us, so we could identify when we're comparing treatment A and treatment B, okay, maybe treatment A is better in terms of survival, but it comes really at an unacceptable quality of life cost.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned, sorry, I just wanted to comment on kind of the quality of life and, you know, questionnaires. And I think this is also part of the challenge. I think many people just think that launching an app that will help us in the healthcare system get information from that end patient, but the patients are bombarded in their daily life, and then yet another survey to fill out, right? Or something, right? So I think it's also back to this, you know, where's the patient in the center of all of this, and patient-led clinical trial design has been picking up on the attention, right? Quite quite a bit.
Absolutely, yeah. Patients really, sometimes they give you incredible insights into what is important to them, and you don't realize it unless you see it from their perspective. So most of the clinical trials we're designing now do have to have patient input. Most of the clinical trial organizations have a structure for getting patient input into the design of trials, and oftentimes patients will prioritize the type of trials they would like to see based on their experience to date.
And so John, like when you're thinking like what's got like you're like Eugene, John and I talk all the time about, you know, research, you know, like using, you know, obviously we're focused on using the Health Beacon in research, but like, you know, you seem super passionate about that area. Like what's inspired you about what could happen in clinical research?
Yeah, so, you know, like take, for instance, breast cancer. When a woman has an early stage breast cancer, we would often give them hormonal treatment as an adjuvant, which is a preventative. So you know the treatment you've given them has a very high chance of curing them, but this hormonal treatment improves the odds a bit. That's the great part of it. The downside of it is that it's taking a tablet every day for 5 years, or sometimes it's an injection that the patient has to take. So being able to monitor that and be sure about that adherence and persistence of that drug treatment is really, really important, because when you do look at it, we realize, when you analyze it carefully, we realize that patients even on trials don't stick to their medication regimen the way we think they do. And there are two dangers there as I see it. If you have or two risks. If you have a potentially quite toxic drug, and in your clinical trial, you think everybody's taking it every day, and they're not, and you see, you know, a small amount of toxicities, you may miss the fact that that toxicity is occurring predominantly in the patients who are taking it every day the way they're supposed to.
Right.
And so you can underestimate toxicity and overestimate the required dose. And a similar problem might be that if testing a brand new drug, for instance, and it turns out it didn't work. Well, if it didn't work globally in your clinical trial, if you know the adherence, you might find that there's a subset of patients with optimal adherence, say greater than 80%, and wow, it did work for those patients. And so rather than throwing away a drug that can benefit the drug company and benefit humanity, you go back and rerun the trial, ensuring you've got optimal adherence. So the whole thing about how much of the drug is actually being taken is an elephant in the room when you try to analyze outcome. And, you know, the essence of good science is to eliminate as many variables as you can in your experimental design. And we are not paying proper attention to adherence, and the tools that are being used, like medical possession ratios and diaries and pill counts, you know, they're very primitive and they're subject to all sorts of errors. So real-time monitoring of what patients are taking when they're on a clinical trial is hugely attractive.
So something like Proteus, which sort of went belly up, right? And you would think that that's like you would think that that's probably one of the best tools to track through the clinical trials. But then again, sort of from a cost perspective, incorporating that into the treatment plan, right? So it's kind of, how do you weigh the great technology that, you know, ultimately sold for, I guess, almost nothing back to Otsuka, right?
In the patient experience, you know, like that, you know, like I have huge respect for the Proteus, you know, endeavor, you know, however, that's kind of now morphed itself in that, you know, so Proteus was an early, you know, they had raised like 500 million or something, you know, an enormous amount of capital. They were putting, what were they doing exactly, Eugene? They put a tag on, you ingested a pill.
It's a pill, right? It's a device, and then it comes, the Proteus version came with almost like a Band-Aid kind of thing, and it would just read off of the pill.
And you can see it going through your system. But, you know, but the patient group I think they started with was like schizophrenics, wasn't it?
I think so.
If I remember right. I don't remember.
Yeah. But I always thought I was definitely not going to be the entrepreneur that tried to get schizophrenics to ingest tracking pills. I was definitely not going to go down that path of all the projects I've taken on in my life. I'm going to go something easier.
I mean, we both know that you're full of great ideas. That's how Health Beacon was born. But I agree that you probably, you know, that's crossing the line for you.
We've got enough schizophrenics on our staff. Yeah, but, you know, to talk to the specifics of Health Beacon, you know, the advantage of that product is that you've got a need there, which is a physical, pragmatic need. You have to get rid of your, you know, dispose of your sharps safely, because it's a sharps sharp smart screen, it gives you the edge in terms of the patients have a need to use it and a need to engage with it. And I think engagement is one of the biggest problems that we're seeing as a difficulty for this whole connected health. You know, there are all sorts of devices that can do all sorts of things, but if the patients don't commit to them and engage with them in the first place and stick with them, they're a very limited capacity or very limited use.
You know what I was always wondering was this idea that, this idea that patients start, volunteering their data. Like if you said, so you start to become like an N of one trial, like your life is like, we're all gonna, eventually, unfortunately at some stage in our life, our health declines, right? And we move on. But, so you have like an N of one trial where you're constantly advancing your health and your treatment and your clinical status, like whatever that is. And then, then you're introducing new things into your life, like you're introducing medicines or you're introducing other stuff, but you're kind of like constantly volunteering your data towards like, people like John who are analyzing it for it, and then you're introducing into it. But I kind of, I'm constantly a subject of a clinical trial.
I mean,
yeah, well,
go ahead.
Don't forget the Framingham study in Massachusetts, where a whole town committed to providing all their biometric type data for decades, and it's been extraordinarily useful.
Yeah, I forget about that one. I remember I loosely. So they gave all their like just
they measured the entire population. They measured everything: blood pressure, weight, everything. But one of the best things that came from it was I remember a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine decades ago where they looked at the weight of the population. Now it may not have been from Framingham, but it was one of these population-based cohort studies, and they looked at average weight as the year went by, and you got to Easter and it went up a gram. And it didn't go down that gram again. And then you get to, July the 4th, another gram, Labor Day, a gram, Thanksgiving, 3 grams, Christmas, Hanukkah, 5 grams. Just never went down. Really fascinating graph.
I feel like going for a run after this. I feel like going for a run after this.
Cleveland Clinic does
to the gym.
Cleveland Clinic does that. I remember, talking to our friends at Cleveland Clinic, and they kind of weigh their population as they're coming into the office, but do it in an anonymized way. I thought they did, so you're effectively being weighed every day, but over a population, so they can see if if they're losing weight or gaining weight as an organization, based on, which is pretty cool. Like where, but they're gaining like thousands of pounds during Easter as an organization.
Also, I mean, Esther Dyson's way to Wellville, right? They're doing like community-based, and I forget how many communities they picked, but sort of community care, and so lots of efforts going on. And I guess the question is, how do we really scale all that out of pilots and interesting data to real world, right? That's always the challenge with a lot of these.
We should definitely. Who set up our the Decentralized Clinical Trial Organization? Who's our Decentralized Clinical Trial lead that was on our podcast just not too long ago?
Oh, Michelle.
Well, we had Michelle. We had Michelle.
I'm blanking.
AMIR. Is it AMIR?
Oh yeah,
AMIR. Yeah, I heard his podcast.
Yeah. Did you listen to his podcast? Yeah. And what, like, when you think about that, like, we should definitely hook you into AMIR. And he came from a background of working in quintiles, right? And the big clinical research. Did you get a chance to kind of look at that as a concept, like the decentralized?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the biggest thing that I don't get is I don't understand why these companies investing in really expensive injectable products, when they do their trials at the outset, why they don't decide to do something to have a really better handle on this parameter. Right. I just don't get that. And I'm not addressing your question particularly, but there's something else I've got to mention about another thought about if you're monitoring adherence in the community on a clinical trial, or indeed in clinical practice. When you see someone drop off and stop taking their medicine when they have been taking it before, that's a red flag, not just for adherence, but if you're using an experimental product or testing a new product, it's also a red flag for toxicity. That could warrant an intervention to prevent a serious adverse event from actually blossoming from a minor issue to a major issue.
Yeah, that's fascinating, right? Like this kind of like what's the expression, the difference between a cure a cure and a poison is dose. Is that expression? Yeah.
Something
So
like
It could be a
that, yeah.
narrow, it's a narrow thing, yeah.
right. And that whole, yeah, in cancer, that's so key, right? Like that's so key, is that balance of how much treatment, what's the tolerance level, and it's very individualized, I'd imagine. So that's kind of done on, over the course of population, and
And John,
Yeah, and
I mean,
these toxic events can occur kind of precipitously. You can talk to someone who's fine today, and tomorrow their immune system is flapped out. It can happen
Right.
really quickly.
like in real time, like,
And we unfortunately, no matter how much we educate patients, we persistently see situations where patients and their families don't appreciate the significance of a deterioration in between cycles of treatment, for instance. And they
Right.
might be at home and may not realize the necessity of getting that family member to an A&E, to an ER straight away. You see that all the
Right.
time. So anything that puts us in better connection with patients when they're not in the hospital is really advantageous on clinical trials.
Right.
Eugene, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how obviously you have such passion for research and science, right? And then to kind of Jim's introduction of you also advise venture fund, which looks at how do you really commercialize these great technologies and research, and how do you look of going from research to that commercial? Like, what in your head is like, how do you get it there, right? Because typically, and again, stereotypically, if you're doing science in the lab, generally you're not great in sort of commercializing things. And in many cases, it's the vice versa, right? You can be a great commercial, but you don't necessarily understand the science. And I think you being sort of that bridge to a certain extent, right? And how do you look at commercializing science?
Well, to go back to your earlier question about the connection between the lab and the clinic, that's a really important one that we are dealing with better than we ever used to. We're doing a lot of what we call translational research. So people who've got lab-driven hypotheses. For instance, I'm working with a Professor Pennington in the Conway Institute in UCD, where his hypothesis is he can detect molecular fingerprints, if you like, in terms of the proteins in the blood of patients with prostate cancer who've had treatment and who, might be experiencing toxicity or about to experience a relapse. He thinks he can find a fingerprint before conventional methods. So in the past, he would have just taken samples from patients willy-nilly, and there wouldn't have been any control. So what we've done is we've linked his research rigidly in with our clinical trial program, so that the data that he's getting about the patients is absolutely clean, and therefore the correlation between what he's seeing is not being muddied by clinical factors that he's completely unaware of. So that's one bridge that is happening progressively, and there's a great realization that we can make progress quicker if we do that. With regard to the commercialization, the thing that's really always struck me in oncology is the relative power of oncology drugs versus radiation oncology versus surgical oncology. That when a new drug comes out, it is relatively easy at community level to take that new effective drug and start administering it. Sometimes there's a paradigm shift in how the drugs work when we went from conventional, chemotherapy that whacks your marrow to sort of immune stimulating drugs. Okay, so there was a whole education shift there, but it's a relatively easy process to take a successful drug into the community. Unfortunately, radiotherapy processes don't come in a little pill container with a label. We have to buy machinery and we have to educate ourselves and figure out how to do these things. And that's why, for me, the clinical trials have been really, really important to push ourselves into that situation where we're pushing the technology boat out and using it on a routine basis. How to get technology in to get good clinical practice to commercialize it, that's a different issue. I've never been involved in where my research has ever gone commercial, although there's quite a potential for the work I'm doing with Steve Pennington in the lab, that if we did detect a molecular signature like that could have huge commercial potential.
Mm-hmm. When you look in, when you're advising, an investment, you're walking in saying, okay, your role in that case is let me test the science, let me test the rigor, let me put my own intuition against it. Is that the kind of role you're playing in that sense?
And as you know, Jim, I stay away from the finance of it because it's not my strength. What I really try and look at is, what's the scientific hypothesis behind what they're doing, and sometimes they can have a great idea, but unfortunately, it may be, there may be many other companies looking at the same thing. Do they have anything really unique? And then, of course, you're looking at the management team and all the usual things you look at as an investor. But you're trying to find somebody that's come up with something unique. And we have not invested in a lot of companies, and I have to say that I can think of one exception that we said no to. We haven't been sorry that we didn't invest in them. There's a lot of startup companies in healthcare fall flat in their face. We've seen several companies that have had great ideas, but unfortunately, you just don't think they're ever going to get into the market ahead of bigger companies, perhaps with less brilliant ideas.
Yeah. Awesome.
Ideas are cheap, right? It's the execution and the validity of those ideas. So
I was hoping we were going to go down the conversation. I know we were serious that we were going to talk about the Amazon. Like John went on a trip to the Amazon. Was it 2 years ago? Was that?
Yeah.
I'm game for that. Let's hear this one.
When you said Amazon, I thought you were going to say about Amazon Health, but I was at the American Society of Therapeutic Radiology Oncology a couple of years ago. And that was I saw an absolutely inspirational talk by a guy from Colorado. He was an A&E doctor. I can't remember his name, but the topic of his conversation was the patient will see you now.
Right.
And he just stood the whole of healthcare up on its head and said, remember when, you had to call for a taxi and wait? And along came Uber and all these other companies. And then, the companies that have totally disrupted air travel. I'm not talking about COVID, I'm talking about the companies.
Right. Yeah.
COVID has certainly screwed that up. COVID's been the ultimate disruptive technology. So he said, healthcare is just phenomenally broken. And there is a desperate need to have huge, big organizations like Amazon and Google really come into the space and redictate it. So you can imagine a scenario where a patient signs up to Google Health. And by signing up to Google Health, they're effectively, they are their health management entity. And they do everything for them. They, put them talking to a bot in the morning. They, look at their app that's connected to their inhaler. They figure out that their asthma is out of control. They monitor the pollen count in their city. They know their route to work, and they figure it's bad news if John goes to work this morning. So they notify his boss that John's not going to work this morning. John is told, take 2 extra inhalers. And as he's taking his inhalers, it's measuring how his breathing is while it's doing this. And then it's simultaneously ordering an extra medicine for him because it knows he needs another medicine. And if John wants to talk to his doctor, he talks to the bot of his choice.
Yeah,
John, I think it just dawned on me. Eric Topol. I think that's who wrote the book. At least the patient will see you now. So I'm assuming that was the speech.
Yeah.
And speaking of books, the kind of what you're sort of describing is a bit The Circle. Have you guys read or seen the movie?
Oh yeah.
So, I mean, it's a little bit different context, but
dystopian.
But notice John still didn't talk about the Amazon itself trip. Did you do like ayahuasca there or something? I don't know.
No, we went there a few years ago, and it's been as a keen angler, it was a lifelong dream of mine. I'm sorry to say the fishing was extremely disappointing, but the place was absolutely awesome. We went to the Peruvian Amazon, and you're 3 days where all you see is mud and jungle go by, and it's just a beautiful place. Lots of dolphins, pink and gray, and lots of piranhas, caimans.
Awesome.
Great place.
So I just got myself a VR set this weekend. I went in for a USB, charger, and I walked out with a Oculus. So
just
I think
a straight Oculus.
Yeah. Just I don't know. Just it was one of those things. Just like looked at me, and I was like, I haven't actually done that. But the reason I brought it up is I think I'm just gonna download like an Amazon trip something.
Yeah. The metaverse.
Yeah, the metaverse. Welcome to the metaverse. I'm just looking at the time, Jim. Is it time for your famous question?
Yeah, John. I don't know if I prepped you on this one properly, but
hey, we're meticulously unproduced, Jim.
So this is not the Graham Norton show where if I don't give a good answer, I get ejected out of my chair backwards, is it?
No,
you just get muted. You just get muted.
This is a happy place. This is just Eugene and Jim's happy place here. It is. So picture yourself a young medic just back from training at one of the top medical institutions, you're Irish by origin, and you arrive back in Ireland, and you're starting up a new company, and you're pitching, and you got a phenomenal idea about, introducing, digital tools into clinical trials. What advice would the Professor John Armstrong give to that young entrepreneur as they're starting off their company?
I think know your clinical space really, really well. Have an absolute in-depth knowledge of the clinical space that you're trying to do this in, and focus on one area, and try and look at it from what part is broken and what part is fixed. So if there's something being done well and consistently well, there's no point in disrupting that. But if you look at a domain of healthcare and you can see that this is not working, the patients aren't happy, the staff aren't happy, the outcomes aren't good, I would try and find that weak point and focus on it.
Awesome.
That was perfect. That was like a 60-second pitch to the entrepreneur. That's awesome.
I think that might have been the best one. That might have been the best one.
Yeah. Well,
We've
John,
asked
so unfortunately, I won't be able to tag you on LinkedIn. So, we'll just have to. You're linked out, but it was a pleasure getting to know you. And thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Eugene.
Thanks, John.
Cheers.
Well done. Well done.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.
And to the millions of listeners, follow, subscribe, and pass it on.